Okay guys, I promised you an answer to this problem that I had, and I appreciate everybody leaving comments as to what you think caused my problem. As you remember, the problem is right here where I had this offset in the print. Now I'll put another piece down here to show you how much of an offset it was. And you can see at this point right here, the printer started skewing off and the whole print shifted all the way down at that point. But the rest of the print is all intact. Now we had several ideas that you guys came up with, and you sent in the comments what you thought may have caused this. And most of those things, well, I could say all of them, I thought of too. First thing I was looking for was some kind of a mechanical problem. One person suggested that my display may be too close and that it may be hitting, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense. Obviously there's plenty of clearance and it really shouldn't have caused that problem. However, I have had problems before with this spring steel sheet. If you get it down and you don't get it on exactly straight, you can see right there it hits. But you'll know that right away. But that wasn't the problem. And we had plenty of clearance here and on the other side. So the bed in the y-axis was not having any restriction. I checked the belt, and I checked the belt the same there as I did on this x-axis. And what I did, I put the head in the position where the distortion started. Then I came over here and moved that along to where right there would be where the pulley would be. Then I brought the belt up to see if there was any damage to the belt, any teeth missing or anything, and the belt was in good shape there. I did the same thing with the belt down here on the y-axis. So the belt didn't seem the problem. I even checked the lock screws on this pulley here to make sure it wasn't slipping, but even with those things, it just wouldn't make sense that if it did jump time on this belt or the pulley, it would shift the whole print job. I've had that happen before, and you get an offset print. And this is kind of an extreme example of an offset print. That's what would have happened to this part if the belt had jumped, either one of them. I checked all the rollers and everything to make sure that we had good alignment on those. So I couldn't find any shift or wobble in anything here. And so, like a lot of you, I started thinking, okay, is there any way the slicer or even the memory in the motherboard or on the chip or something could cause that? I actually took a chip from another printer that was printing the same part without problems, put it in this machine, and it still had the same identical problem. So it wasn't in the G-code file or the slicer. So what's left? Well, at this point, I was about to pull my hair out, trying to figure out what could possibly cause that. It actually looked like a mechanical thing, like something mechanical on the printer. And I went back and I double checked my x-axis and double checked the y-axis and the movement of everything. And that is when I realized it was right in front of me all the time. I had been looking at the problem and I was blind and could not see. Okay, I've recreated the problem on this printer, and we're going to print, and I'm going to show you how I found the cause of the problem. Remember, it's when it gets to this point that we started having the skewing of the print. It's going to start printing this perimeter. So on the very first layer, back here in the corner, you'll see the problem. Okay, we're printing the perimeter now, and we'll go ahead and let it Okay, now looking at it, I can already see the skewing. We'll put a straight edge across there. You can see it a little better. Right here it's skewing down, and up here it's coming in. It's doing the same thing it did on this print. And you're seeing the same thing that I saw. The only question is, remember I said that I was blind and could not see, but okay, I'm not going to keep you in suspense any longer. Now look very closely right here. When this head gets over here, notice the position of this tube, and now you can see an obvious wobble there. What happened is this printer prints about 24/7, has been doing that for months and months, and a lot of things have worn out on it, fan motors and everything else. And when I have different problems, I tell you guys about them. But this one really had me stumped. I'm going to go ahead and pause this print. Now when this carriage comes over, you can see that there's not much stress on that tube, but when it reaches this point, then it's starting to pull to the left a little bit. And then it pulls harder and holds it to the left. Then when it comes back, it relieves the pressure on it. And that's what was happening. When it got over here, it was pulling on that. The reason that thing was moving was because the two screws that mounted in there had finally worked loose. Now, why would they ever come loose? Well, could be a lot of reasons. Could be they weren't tightened down tight enough at one time. But I suspect it's just a combination of things, but more than likely this printer running like it has been just continuously, there's a constant pressure on the top of this. And let me take it apart and show you. Okay, now that we've got this cover off, you can see that there's a little bit of movement right there. And that little bit of movement is because these two screws are no longer tight, and they're allowing this to move. What was happening was that when it was going back to the left, there was pressure pushing out on this tube, and it was keeping it in this position. Once it got to this point, the pressure changed, it started pulling on it, and it would pull this thing, cause it to come out. And that was the skewing. And that's why it wasn't abrupt. It kind of gradually went into that. If you look at the print, you'll see that it was going along fine. Then it started pulling right here and then leveled off at that point, because then it was all the way forward. But just had that little bit of movement. And to fix that, all we have to do is just retighten these two screws. And when I tighten screws, I always use the wrench in my hand. I don't use any pliers or anything with it to add any torque to it. If you do that, you can over tighten these, you can break the screws, you can crack plastic parts, like when you're tightening down a screw on your fan here. So you don't want to over tighten them, but you want to make sure they're tight enough. Now we've got everything back together. We'll do a test print on this thing and see how it checks out. Okay, as you can see, our first layer came out perfect. No longer do we have this distortion in this corner that we had before. And I've shown you how we corrected the distortion one more time. As you can see, it started right here and continued on in that area, and then it cleared up when it came back. And that was all because the pressure being put on this hot end, starting there, it pulled on it and it kept pressure on it, then it released. And that's what was skewing the print. This printer has been printing 24/7, and it's been printing a lot of these parts and some other large parts for other customers. So it has constantly been going the full distance, extremes, and I think that's why we had this problem. A lot of the printers here print smaller parts, and they're sitting here working in the center like this and put very little stress on these wires and this tube and so forth. But when you go from one extreme, especially to this extreme where it's usually pulling a little bit, make sure that you've got plenty of slack there, that you're not overstressing this. Running as often as I do, it could start wearing, because you're talking about metal screws up against that aluminum heat sink, and aluminum's not real strong, and just the slight bit of movement or pressure against it consistently like this over time can cause a little bit of friction between that screw and that aluminum will give, and the aluminum will be ground down. You can actually grind it down at that screw enough to loosen the screw, and then with all the vibrations and everything, that screw will just back off a little bit. And I think that's what happened here and gave me that little motion. But if I'd had X-ray vision and was Superman, I would have seen that little bit of movement there, but I never saw it. And it was right in front of me all the time. And finally I could see it, even though I couldn't see it moving. I thought, you know, what if? And sure enough, when I took my hands in there, then I could see the movement, and that was the solution to the problem. So hopefully this will be helpful. If anybody else sees anything like this down the road, it might save you a lot of time trying everything else. Fortunately, I didn't get to the point of swapping out the motherboard, but if I hadn't found that, it would have gotten to the point where I would have swapped the motherboard out to see if it was the computer board or not. And then I've been really frustrated after changing the board out and still have the same problem. Well, I hope that answered the question for everybody. And now we can go ahead and get this printer back in service and put it back to work. I really appreciate all of the comments that we got and suggestions as far as what might be causing this problem. And we'll continue to do videos like this, especially when we find unusual problems that we want to share with you guys, and let you know about them and what we found out, because anytime someone can give you some additional information, even though you may not be able to use it today, if it helps you down the road, that's great. A lot of you guys have helped me out, given me tips and comments and so forth, and I appreciate that. And I try to make adjustments accordingly. Be sure to subscribe and leave a comment. I'd like to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and happy printing.